Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Jameel Arts Center. It's so nice to see a big crowd here. I'm Noura Razian. I oversee the exhibitions here, and I'm delighted to host Shumon Basar and Farah Qasimi in conversation on the occasion of her Artist Room exhibition here with us. And just to introduce our kind of Artist Room exhibition series, this is a series of exhibitions, of run-room exhibitions dedicated to artists from the Art Jameel collection. So currently we have 3 artist rooms, Seher Shah, Himali Butta, and Farah Qasimi. And along with these exhibitions, we publish a monograph which contains images of the works, but also related images and commissioned text and interviews. So we've asked Shumon to be in conversation with Farah as they've known each other for some time, and he had commissioned her work in 2017 as part of the Global Art Forum Trading Places. So he commissioned her to photograph DragonBot as part of that. And some of the images here are kind of a continuation of that body of work as well. So I'll just quickly introduce both speakers and then let them get on with it. So Shumon Basar is a writer, curator, and cultural critic. He's the commissioner of the Global Art Forum in Dubai, which, as you know, the next iteration is next week. He's editor-at-large of Tank magazine and contributing editor at Bidoon, and he's also director of the format program at the Architectural Association School of London. He's co-authored The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present with Douglas Copeland and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Farah Qasimi lives in New York, although she does quite a lot of her work here in the Emirates. So she's back and forth quite often. She studied music and photography at Yale, where she also got her MFA. And she's been showing her work consistently over the years, most recently as part of UAE Unlimited at El Sirkal Avenue in 2018. She had a show also at Helen Anrather, I think the year before, and also at the Third Line in 2016. So welcome both speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Antonia, and the whole Jameel team for this invitation to both Farah and myself this evening. Thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to see so many of you. So I want to organize this conversation kind of chronologically as possible, and as much as possible. I want to avoid the kind of annoying, cloying over-familiarization that can happen when two friends do this kind of thing in public, because although I do consider Farah now a friend, it did all start with her work and the images that she produced and continues to produce. Back in 2013, I went to a show here in Dubai at a place called The Pavilion, which was a space in downtown Dubai that no longer exists, but which in its own way played an important role as a meeting place and as a display place. There I saw large-scale photos of intimate UAE domestic scenes laced with these extreme, brilliant acid colors, and it had an immediate effect on me. They weren't simply beautiful, although beauty was a component, nor were they particularly grandly formal, although composition also played an important role. Instead, these photos had a kind of exuberant combination of joy and sadness, a kind of loopy focus on the not center of a scene. At that point, Sunny Rabah introduced me to the artist, Farah Qasimi. Farah was born 2 years after the Tiananmen Square massacre and 20 years after the formation of the UAE. And I do believe that for someone that was only 21 or 22 at that time, she'd already formed a kind of precocious, sickly sweet style that, again, I've been very interested in for the last several years. And whereas most images of the UAE tend towards what I call predictable stock and awe, so if you think of the Burj Khalifa and camels and desert in some combination with each other, I think that's normally how the UAE gets transmitted and conveyed, particularly to the outside world. Farah's pictures form a catalogue that I believe is atmospherically nuanced and also importantly, something that's very necessary. So will you please join in welcoming Farah Al-Qasimi? Thank you. So, Farah, before we get to the pictures in this room, I'd like to go backwards to some kind of before. And the first question is very, very simple and straightforward, and I wonder if the answer will be. But was there a point at which you realized that the photos that you were taking when you were much younger, was there some point where you thought these were no longer just snapshots that the rest of us take? And of course, in that question is embedded, was there a kind of epiphanic moment where you thought, this is what I want to do, potentially for the rest of my life?
I think so. Can you hear me? First of all, I readjusted my mic, so I don't know. No. Yeah? No?
No.
Okay. Oh, it might not be on. Test? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming. I kind of came across photography by accident. I was, as you mentioned, studying music in college, and I was having a really hard time adjusting to life outside of the Emirates. And there was a series of art classes that I had taken, mostly in painting and drawing. But it was in my 4th year of school that I started to feel really depressed and really desperate in terms of just needing to seek a life outside of my immediate environment. And so in this kind of act of desperation, I went onto allposters.com, which is like a cheap, poster website, and I bought this huge 12 by 9 foot mural of a palm tree on a beach. It was obviously a stock photo, and it was really ugly. It was very pixelated, and the colors were really saturated, and it came in 6 panels that you had to put together yourself, and the wallpaper didn't fit to my wall because I had these decorated moldings in my kind of older apartment building, so it didn't sit flush against the wall, and it kind of draped pathetically. And there was something about that, my need to exit, or my need for transportation into this magical, inaccessible space. That was just being disrupted by its inability to lie flat on the wall, and just be two-dimensional. So instead of having it be this beautiful feature in my bedroom, I actually I photographed it and looked at it as a photograph, looked at it as a separate image, that had its own kind of organization and its own logic and its own space, and that for me was something that felt like. It felt like an impulse that made a lot of sense. That was an attempt to both kind of realize my own desires and also make sense of my failure at achieving them.
And before that, had you not really been taking photos that much?
Not that much.
In a more, I guess, in an amateur way?
Yeah, I would say. I had taken, I didn't really take a photography class until I was about 18 or 19. And even then, I took a darkroom black and white class. But it felt like this separate, inaccessible thing to me. It felt like art with a capital A, and it was really calming and lovely to go into the dark room and to be developing film in complete blackness. But it just felt, I think that there was something necessary at the time about the delay of taking a photograph and then seeing it later. I think there was something necessary in the task of slowing down. But it wasn't really until I started to think seriously about how photographs could function until I took a digital class, and also applied what I knew here, because I was coming home to the Emirates once a year at the time. It was all I could afford to do when I was in school. And so I came home once in the time that I had learned how to use a camera, which was my 4th year and last year of college. And that was completely transformative because I was able to suddenly come back to the Emirates, which I had not been a part of for the previous 3 years, really, and to actually see things in a completely new light.
And speaking about that there and here, can you remember how early on you realized that these kind of very stereotypical, almost school of photography was existing?
Mm-hmm.
which ultimately is is kind of 21st century Orientalism. Was that something? I mean, did you know that growing up here, or was that something that you felt or you saw more once you'd left here and you were abroad?
It's hard to say because I think it exists in several different contexts. I think there's like advertising imagery or journalism, that is not really meant for the audience here, that is really meant to kind of communicate an outsider's perspective of a place that is not understood or not often seen. But then there's also the kind of fine artist perspective or the fine art photographer perspective, which is in my mind the kind of like Vice Bros or like Dazed Bros or the kind of Stephen Shores or Joel Sternfelds who have come here, or Andrew Moore, who have come here and produced large-scale photographic works, in a short amount of time and then left. And so those people I was much more aware of when I was in college, and then aware of the possibilities of an artistic practice, in the Emirates and about the Emirates. And I think that maybe one of the first projects that I came across was Joel Sternfeld's iPhone book, I Dubai, and it's a small book of iPhone photographs that are taken in I think it's just the Dubai Mall or Dubai Mall and Mall of the Emirates, and I had been incredibly inspired by the for those of you who don't know, Joel Sternfeld is a large format American landscape photographer. And Stephen Shore is also an important American landscape photographer who was kind of rose to prominence in the 70s. And so they were two people that I had admired greatly, but when I looked at their photographs of the Emirates, I thought, well, what is this? This is like, you gave a child, like an 8-year-old an iPhone, and they would probably take more imaginative pictures than this. They scream of just like, they scream of the wrong kind of marveling to me. And it was kind of like, whoa, look at these freaks who have, all these weird social customs. And it felt like so sorely misseen or so poorly seen. And there was something about that made me suddenly really protective of the Emirates in a way that I wasn't before. Because it was getting all of this attention around that time, this was kind of around when the World Islands were making headlines. And they hadn't been completed until several years later, but this is right after the crash of 2008. So a lot of projects were picking back up again, and Dubai was kind of on the map as this, this city of wild ambition. So that was.
I'm wondering. Obviously, anger was one emotion that you would feel. A certain protectiveness suddenly about your culture and where you're from. I was also wondering whether you felt consciously or unconsciously that there was a kind of important moral necessity for kind of counter narratives to be produced, and in your case, I guess primarily images. I mean, I think there are also writers who could feel that, or filmmakers, and whether you think that kind of counter narrative to, the outsider who swoops in for 48 hours and leaves, can only come from someone who's grown up here.
I think that's a good question, and I think you phrased it really interestingly, because I didn't start making the work as a counter-narrative. I started making it's not necessarily the work that you see here, but it's the first major body of work that I made in the Emirates, which turned into a book called Body Shop, and was shown at the Third Line in 2014 in the project space. So that was really work that I made. So I had moved here in 2012 after I graduated from college, and I was working a full-time job at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I was really learning how to be here again. Learning how to live with my parents and have this 9 to 5, and also be completely cut off from the resources that I had been so dependent on for the past 4 years. And I made work out of my own necessity, to engage with the Emirates. I don't know, if other people felt this way, but I felt growing up in Abu Dhabi that I had this automatic, I was automatically kind of cut off from public space for so many reasons, one of them being my gender. But then also the way that urban space is built out is that it doesn't really allow for a lot of pedestrian traffic. And this is true across the Emirates, but particularly in Abu Dhabi. And so I felt so immediately and desperately curious about this place that I had only ever grown up knowing from the passenger seat or back seat of a car, because I had never learned to drive. I was never old enough to drive when I lived here. So those things were really just out of necessity, out of a feeling of loneliness and curiosity, out of just like a pure need. And I would basically just spend nights and weekends wandering around the Emirates, like wandering, driving to Ras Al Khaimah or driving to Dubai, really just taking walks and going to some of the places that are not immediately accessible or that are not immediately visible as you're moving around less consciously. And then that's when that started. And then a couple of years later, when I moved to the US, all of a sudden it started being framed as a counter-narrative by forces outside of my control. And I don't really think of it as a counter. I think of it as its own thing, and that that has come up a lot in conversations that I've had about like my perceived responsibility as an artist who might choose to respond to stereotype. And I certainly have tried to do that before, but I like to just think of it as its own separate thing, and that it might, on its own, maybe counter some of the work, but some of the maybe less nuanced work that's being made. And then to answer your other question about whether I think that somebody who grew up, is that what you said?
Whether that whether there's a very like traditional essentialist argument that only someone who grew up here could produce that kind of authentic counter-narrative to the so-called outsider.
I think that's maybe a little bit too essentialist for me. I think that anybody who knows a place in any aspect, who has really spent time there, and who has spent who has put a significant amount of, or gone through a significant amount of growth in a place, and really put an effort into knowing it. I think anybody could make work that comes from a place of genuine curiosity and also genuine attentiveness. I think it gets back at one of my least favorite conversations, which is like how there's this obsession with the Emirati artist, and with kind of like really pushing this sense of nationalism within the art world that doesn't actually serve any of us, because one of the major strengths of this country is that it is, it does contain so many different people and so many different backgrounds and perspectives. And I think that for me, that is what I'm trying to also pay attention to in the work, to really think about how those things look, and how Dubai or the Emirates at large, how our unique aesthetics are actually part of this kind of hybrid sense of what is beautiful or how things should look.
That's a really good segue, I think, into the next part, which is to sort of want to delve into these pictures in this room. And my first sort of point of entry will actually be, Nora mentioned DragonBot. I've written a text in the booklet. I recommend you all go get it. It's in the bookshop, isn't it? Yes. A handsome price. Beautifully designed, beautifully laid out. So I've written an essay. I'm just going to read out a small excerpt to sort of set the scene for those of you who don't know about this magical place that both Farah and I are obsessed with. The essay actually is expanded from an essay I wrote in art papers in Atlanta, originally in 2017. So big up to Victoria Camblin for commissioning that. Okay, so, quote, "Where can you find 1 in a million or 1,000,000 in one?" End quote. Is this a line from a short story by Argentinian fabulist Jorge Luis Borges? Close, but no. You'll find it on the website for DragonBot, the largest trading hub for Chinese products outside mainland China, located in Dubai. For more than a decade, DragonBot has been a gateway to Middle East and North African markets. DragonBot contains multitudes of fabulous things, all of which are manufactured, catalogued, shipped, and sold. It sells the sanctuary of selling itself. If the word museum were less preciously protected, I'd argue that DragonBot is one of the greatest contemporary museums I know of, a riot of signs, sentiments, surfaces, and liberating spelling mistakes, for English is not the first language here, and indeed, why should it be? So for the 11th edition of Global Art Forum, which was entitled Trading Places, I commissioned Farah Al-Qasimi to turn her lens on DragonBot's limitless interiors. Her pictures picked out the peculiar exchange between traditional Emirati interior styles, think Marie Antoinette at max volume, and their manufactured source in Shenzhen factories. There's also the sublime emotion of forlorn furniture, frayed imperfection in sales displays. Plastic bags seem happy, then sad. Farah eyes up trompe-l'oeil wallpapers, which bring forth forest waterfalls, or a beach, lovely and lonely, nature as a printed screensaver. So, I mean, there are obviously a number of pictures here, but I want to start with the ones from DragonBot. Again, very simple question. I went to DragonBot for the first time 2007, I believe. When did you first go to DragonBot? Was it during childhood or
No,
later
it was.
on?
I think it was around 2012 or 13 when I first moved back to the Emirates. I think I was looking for curtains.
And why did you go there?
Everybody had told me to go there. Everybody. It was so strange because it's not like there's any lack of information about DragonBot online, but it seemed like it existed only in word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
They've really updated their website recently, and it's interesting because on the front page, their homepage, it's like the perfect, like the nuclear Emirati family with the huge dragon emblem behind them. But they didn't have a huge internet presence. It was kind of like trading, FZCO, here's the address, figure it out.
So we've been going together now for a few years. When I first went there, and indeed every time we go back, I kind of imagine that we're descendants of Walter Benjamin when he wandered through the 19th century arcades of Paris, or indeed like the Situationists in 1950s, also in 1950s Paris. So I think of ourselves as flaneurs. I think of ourselves going on these Derrives. I think of psychogeography, which is a term that obviously the Situationists made kind of famous. And also this a phrase from Roland Barthes. It's the name of his book about Japan, which is called Empire of Signs. But I also think of DragonBot as also a kind of empire of signs. So again, what has the experience been for you, the initial times that you went, and why do you keep going back again and again?
The initial experience was one of just being completely overwhelmed by visual information and by the desire to buy everything that I was seeing. It felt like they were like these shops were just speaking to me, and me only. And it wasn't. I mean, it's kind of like the IKEA complex where you go into IKEA for one thing, but you end up like coming out with, crazy salt shakers and then like a fly swatter, and you forget what you went in there to buy. And that was very much my experience at DragonBot. But the reason why I keep going back, it's funny that I don't know if we've talked about the theory of the Derrive before, maybe we have, but it's basically, I have started to teach it in my classes, but it's basically the idea that you might wander a space without any intention, and that you might just allow yourself to experience the built landscape and allow it to affect you and really kind of penetrate you in new ways. And that's kind of, that's what I love about DragonBot, is that every time I go, and for those of you who haven't been, it is set up very much, it's in the shape of a dragon, but it's set up very much like a traditional bazaar in the sense that you have the main, the kind of like spine of the mall of the dragon, but then you also have these snaking alleyways. And I have been there so many times, but I still cannot visualize the geography or the architecture of the building in a way that makes any sense to me. There's just this like cognitive barrier at just grasping the size of it. So like the alleyways have their own alleyways, and every time you go, you see something that you recognize, and you're like, oh, I know this guy. But then when you come back the next week, you will not find him again. He's like disappeared, and I'm convinced that it moves. That maybe like one branch actually just curves this way, and then the next week it's over there. And that's what I love about it, is that every time I go, I really do have this new experience. And sometimes I meet people who have really interesting, stories about why they're there, or the shops that they've opened up. And I think yesterday was actually the first time that I went there with a purpose. And
Which was the purpose?
Which was to choose a bench for our Basel Statements booth, because we're making an installation. And I actually found something that it was so difficult for me not to get distracted, because you go in and then there's the end part where DragonBot 2 is where all the furniture is, where all the kind of like Baroque furniture is. And I mean, you get so distracted because it's so beautiful and so ornate, and they have these little, fake living rooms that you can hang out in and imagine that they're yours. But there's like 10 shops that are all called Golden Sun, and they're all by a Chinese company called Golden Sun, which is the same company, but they all have a different specialty. So like one Golden Sun is like the Khaliji living room, like, super ornate, super Baroque, like gold trimming, brocade fabric shop. The other Golden Sun is for office furniture. The other Golden Sun is for not tacky office furniture. The other Golden Sun is, and so on and so on. So I don't know. It's really special, and it's hard to explain why. But every time I go, I walk out with something that brings me joy.
Speaking about leaving with something that didn't bring us any joy at all, but ended up with a really fantastic image.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd talk about the making of one of the photos here. So one back there, a very large one, kind of neon flora, and in the middle, you can see, is this spherical object, which is actually this thing here, called Mirror Ball. So Farah, can you tell us what happened between us discovering that, haggling to buy 2 of those, the profound disappointment that followed, but then the fact that you managed to make an amazing picture out of it.
So to counter my own statement from 5 minutes ago, we went there, I think last summer. It was like a year ago or a year and a half ago.
A few months ago, I think.
Oh, was it really?
Who knows?
Whatever.
Time.
So we went there together on one of many trips, and it was actually the first time that I had gone to DragonBot at night, and so it's this whole new thing at night, this whole new life form, and this woman had a shop that was basically like all LED lights and like car accessories and fans. And she had this incredible display outside, so that's actually in DragonBot, like that's kind of spilling out of her shop, this display. And we both immediately stopped in our tracks and were like, oh my God, what is that? We have to buy all of it. So we went and decided at the same time that the orb was the thing that we wanted, right? Because the orb, in that photograph, I think it has like a map on it, but it had Chinese, so it's a spinning, it displays as like a rotating LED message, and it had like Chinese text, English text, things that said like open, closed, everything that you could possibly imagine. And it was like, wow.
Sorry, it was like the whole of Blade Runner in a small globe.
In a little dome.
Yeah.
And so we were both like, oh my God, we have to have that. We have to buy it. And we went inside, and we haggled with the lady. She wanted like a lot of money for it. She wanted like 100 dirhams for it. We brought it down to, I think it was 35 or 40.
I can't remember.
And she was like, okay, fine, whatever, just get out of my hair. And she packed it up, and we both were like, yes, we were so happy. We thought we had found the most incredible thing ever. And I obviously photographed it. I think Shimon's shoe is actually cropped out of that photograph because we were both
Typical.
so transfixed by this incredible avatar garden of lights. So we both go home separately. I go back to Abu Dhabi. I hid it back here for the dramatic reveal.
The undramatic reveal.
The undramatic reveal. So this is what it looks like. Okay. No one's gasping.
Neither did we. Well, other than with disappointment and horror, I think.
So we both text each other also at the same time, what the hell is going on? It came with, okay, this is really, really dramatic. You have to, everybody hold your breath.
You really have to, the rapture that we were feeling in the presence of this thing.
Yeah, you think you're going home with that.
And you open it up, then that thing comes out, and then a gold mini CD. And no instructions, nothing, no cables. And then I start to inspect the side. It's basically a laptop, Windows PC laptop from about 1997, and a kind of SVGA cable, and then all the instructions are in Chinese. And the feeling of, like, the distance between the sublime joy of that and the abject sadness and disappointment of this is probably life. And that is life, I think, between that and this. And then I texted you, and you had the same situation.
Yeah, same exact
and we
situation.
realized we'd been totally conned.
But it was our fault, technically.
By a haggling Chinese lady.
It was our fault for not making sure, and it was also our
didn't
fault
do
for
due
believing
diligence, did
it.
we?
But there was something about, like, okay, so I'm supposed to kind of find the VGA cable myself. I'm supposed to go out and buy it.
I'm supposed to teach myself Chinese.
Yeah, I'm supposed to find anything that can play a mini disc.
Mini disc? How?
And just so you know, the images on the orb on the package are of Santa going down a chimney and a tree. So it really had everything. But it's true,
The
though.
text
That
is
was
beautiful. China's wisdom, globally available. Equivalent to 10,000 Chinese characters, CHINSE, or 1,500 standard pictures, and with computer link-up from internet downloading up-to-date information. The inner broadcasting also, but would from wound characters, photograph to Mirrorball. Mirrorball leaves the factory interpose, have already stored the multi-unit animated cartoon,
Not true.
several hundred photographs, characters, content, etc. This leaves the factory interpose, may demand to, and it goes on.
But
Look, what an amazing photograph.
Well, okay, so
it brought about.
It made me think of, I was talking to somebody before this, and I can't remember exactly what we were talking about, but it made me think of this Susan Sontag quote where she talks about why people photograph, and she says something along the lines of, people photograph because you can't possess reality, but you can possess an image of reality. So there's this sense of belonging, and there's also the sense of rendering something immortal. And for me, it was that moment of absolute joy and wonder of stumbling upon this, this small space that I so deeply wanted to enter. And in a way, it's like the beach mural that could never properly fit on my wall. It's just that hope and that failure that so often go hand in hand.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to ask about this sort of, you mentioned at the beginning as your like epiphany, but you do take a lot of pictures of existing images, and especially these sort of large trompe-l'oeil backdrops of which DragonBot is filled. And we've got one here, which is actually, but not from DragonBot, from China Mart in Ajman.
Yes.
Which is another one of these.
Yeah.
But what is it about taking photos of photos that appeals so much to you?
For me, a lot of the time it's about what things lie on top of those photographs and how to kind of create a layered space that, and then bring it into a different space where the photographs can be then, placed into this context. So for me, this photograph is just as much about the the transformative quality of the wallpaper as it is about all of the inescapable ephemera that's in front of it, like the office chair and the kind of like, the documents, the brick wall that suggests a kind of quick ending of the dreamy space, the binders. So for me, it's about adding these little layers of space to kind of flatten multiple planes into one, and possibly continue the process of flattening and creating, bringing spaces into other spaces. I think there was another version of a wallpaper that Helena and I did last year, where the only thing that is basically that makes it identifiable as a photograph is a wall socket and a switch. And I also like that you can play with scale when you have these things, and you can begin to see the rips, you can begin to see the seams, and you can also begin to create new seams as well.
So for me, well, I use the word or the phrase empire of science, but actually DragonBot is also kind of empire of taste. But going there always reminds me how I've actually become more and more bored by the tyranny of good taste. And by good taste, I use that as a shorthand to describe things like mid-century Western modernism, or the kind of globalized minimalism that we also see, in every hipster coffee shop on every corner in the world. I was wondering if you've been interested in developing, or indeed possess, a theory of good and bad taste, especially since you mentioned it before in passing that traditional Emirati interiors have tended to eschew minimalism completely, and instead you have these kind of Baroque or Rococo encrustations of print on print on print, et cetera, et cetera. So could you say something about taste and if and how that plays into how you think about the images that you make?
I think the idea of taste is very complicated here, because I think there are classist connotations to taste around the world that don't really apply to the kind of economic ecosystem here and the kind of the world of interior taste. I think one thing that happened a lot when I was in graduate school and I was making some of these images, that everybody asked me about my relationship to kitsch. And I don't really think of a lot of these homes as kitsch at all, because I think there's a sincerity to them that is not usually present when we talk about kitsch. And so I continue to think about what that means, and also what it means that that kind of furniture is really easily accessible to people of a range of economic backgrounds. So to point to a specific example, that that chandelier is actually it's part of a big chandelier display at a hypermarket called Walmart with 2 L's. That's just on the outskirts of Abu Dhabi. So it's literally called Walmart Hypermarket, and so it sells different kinds of Baroque furniture. Some of it is produced in China. Some of it is produced. It's usually produced in China and then upholstered in a warehouse in Shahama, which is also just outside of Abu Dhabi. So it is very much accessible, and I think my theory, I haven't found anything to kind of corroborate this, but my theory is that it is a kind of leftover of colonial ideals of taste that were brought over in the 20th century that remain and have become the norm, but have become their own things through these multiple layers and years of translation. So I think it's also the kind of thing where many of us, maybe this goes back to your earlier question about people who grew up here, I think many of us literally grew up informed by these aesthetics and would not consider them distasteful or would consider them kitsch in the way that I certainly don't. I mean, I look at these spaces with really a kind of reverence and admiration, and just for the kind of the joy and color that they contain. And I think the home is a really sacred space for a lot of Emiratis. All homes have walls around them, as is the law, and it really becomes a space of refuge and a space of possibility for a lot of people who prefer to be in their homes.
So speaking of homes, I also want to talk about some of the other pictures here. In my text, I write, Farah's portraits take place in an ostensibly opposite kind of space to the one we've been thinking about, i.e. DragonBot, the intimacy of her friends and family's houses. But these two seem like stage sets, choking with color and pattern. These settings to me seem like another kind of museum. What do you try to do when you take photos of close friends and families, often and usually in their own domestic environments?
I try. I think it's a complicated question for anybody who makes portraits who has any sort of moral compass to find a middle ground between getting a photograph that I'm excited about and giving the person an experience that is enjoyable for them. And two of my most photographed subjects are here, so maybe they can weigh in later. But when I first started making portraits here, I started thinking about anonymity and how a lot of people prefer to be anonymous in photographs. And I wanted to think about how I could potentially disrupt that idea or that notion that portraiture has to be revealing of a person's features or revealing of a person's face. So instead of treating it like a formal problem, I wanted to think of it like a formal challenge, or that could eventually become imbued with its own meaning. And so I basically would just go to friends' houses and then kind of like look at the space and think with them, brainstorm with them about what kinds of things they had present. Think about how to kind of allow for a moment of real expressiveness or real, a kind of explosion of action that might reflect either their personality or the dynamics of the space. So, for example, in that one right there called Living Room Vape, that it's a stage photograph, to use a word that you used, but it's not really staged in the sense that I asked them to repeat an action that was already being performed without the camera present. And I think often to bring up Susan again, because she's the queen of writing about photography. She talks on photography, she talks about how photographing a person is essentially like violating them because you show them in a way that they have never seen themselves, and they have to look at it, right? They have to contend with this version of themselves that is not theirs. I hope to not violate, and I know anybody can bend what the perceived power dynamic is between a person photographing and a person photographed. But my intention is for the process to be as collaborative as possible, and to also think about, with some of the interiors, how to really create an archive of Emirati interiors that isn't currently present in any of our archives or any of our history, just because these things are not usually publicized, and there's a deep respect for formality and social boundary.
So there's an archival aspect to it.
I think so.
Well, right?
Yeah.
Because, as you say, I mean, many people can live here for many, many years and maybe not necessarily see firsthand what a local household looks like.
Right.
I just want a little bit about America, because you've studied there recently and you're continuing to live there. A sort of gnarly question, but you had a show at your gallery in New York last year. It was, I think, very successfully received. How important is recognition from the bastions of Western culture, Art Forum, New Yorkers, etc., to an artist from anywhere in the world?
It's important for my parents so that they believe that what I'm doing is okay. I don't know. I think it's important insofar as it brings visibility to your work. But I think for me the most exciting thing has been having people write about it in a way that makes me and the photographs feel really, truly seen. Kaylin Wilson-Goldie actually wrote a really, really beautiful essay, or a really beautiful review in Art Forum, and she's somebody who's familiar with the region that felt very much like how I had intended. So it can also be affirming, thinking about what a cold read to your work might look like to somebody who's not aware of the cultural content. I think that is important. And then there's there's the other side, which is when somebody only frames your work as like, this happens a lot in the West, where like, if you're from a different part of the world that's not the Western world, your work is only about where you come from. So it's like, so then my work becomes about the Emirates. And yes, it is to an extent, but it's also about these very particular parts of life in the Emirates that might indicate something about the place that is, that is more specific or revealing than just like a general survey.
Thank you. I've got a few more broader questions, but I've been instructed, as is my duty, to open it up to you. Does anyone have a question for Farah that they would like to ask? If not, I'm going to plow on for another few minutes, if that's okay. Keep simmering. I want to ask a question, actually, that in a sense actually involves all of us. So you're a photographer practicing in an age of ubiquitous photography, right? we all take pictures here. We all upload them. We all get affirmation from them. We tend to broadcast them. What today makes the difference between a so-called professional photographer and everyone else? Is it techniques, or is it something else?
It's definitely not techniques, because anybody with enough of a budget can buy a wonderful DSLR and take beautifully made photographs. For me, it's attentiveness. It's really just it's attentiveness to the world and how it works, attentiveness to the relationships between people. Just a kind of commitment to really looking at things, and I mean that in all. I mean that in all of it, like looking in all of its forms. I'm constantly taking photographs, even if I'm just looking into my iPhone just to see how something looks in a photograph. It's for me, it's very much about how somebody chooses to organize space, what parts of the world they choose to edit out. And I think photography, I think, is really being picked up a lot as a kind of art form in contemporary art. But for me, I get really excited when, not just when somebody's work is like beautifully formed images, like thinking about like Torbjorn Rodland or Ro Etheridge, or people who really make beautifully made images that maybe are in dialogue with the history of commercial photography. But I really care about people who have something interesting to say and something that they're looking at. And I think that aesthetics is a part of that, but I don't think that it's all of it.
It's interesting. Susan Sontag's definition of an intellectual as someone who pays attention to the world. You recently graduated, and now you're teaching, or you've been teaching. I wonder if you could tell us what that quick transition was like, the switch, and also what's important to you now to be teaching to your students. Again, I think back in the day, certainly with analog photography and deep in analog, a lot of it had to do with technique, right? Just like learning the skills of how to take a good photograph and then how to develop it, frame it, all of these kind of things. How much is techniques or how much is something else, given, again, the kind of image environment that we live in is so radically different than even 10 years ago?
I think what I really try and teach is exactly that spirit of attentiveness. I ask my students to do assignments that when they first hear, they're immediately like, oh, I have to do that. But when they come back, they're like, oh my God, I'm so excited by this or that, or I never considered that this building that I walk by every day could contain this. So I don't know, just maybe the radical possibility that what is around them is enough and could be enough if they do the work. I don't let them use their iPhones. Everybody's always like, can I take pictures on my iPhone? And the answer is always no, because even though I do that sometimes, but there has to be a kind of separation that you're making from like passive looking and active looking. So I teach that. What I hope is that I teach them an interest in the world at large. I think teaching in the US is really challenging right now because there's a lot of conversations happening in US universities that are really centered on American identity politics, and sometimes I try and remind my students that there is a world outside of the US and that it might help us sometimes to talk in different terms or in different definitions.
Thank you. Any questions from you guys? Over here, please.
Is that Hind?
Yes. Yeah, to Hind.
Hi.
A question, or I've been thinking about kind of interpretation or analyzing pictures of here. So there's a lot of identity of here, and kind of how would these images be thought of here compared to showing the same display of images outside of here, and here being the region, and what kind of discussions have had? I don't know, I'm just kind of curious, like what is the role of these images? Do they play two roles? Like there's something about here where, okay, you talk about documentation or pictures that bring me joy or whatever, and then presented outside the region, is it to explain to people what this is? I don't know, so just I know, I hope I've articulated it, but just thoughts I've been thinking whilst you're talking about your work. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond to that, or? Okay. No, thank you. I mean, it's certainly something that I think about a lot, which is like, how to kind of how to think about the double reading of the images and whether it's something that I want to acknowledge. So far, I have kind of tried to free myself of the burden of asking the work to explain things about the region, because I think that that immediately gives weight to an audience that doesn't understand it. And while I want my images to be accessible to those people, I don't necessarily. I think that for me, what art could possibly try and do is, or at least what I would like to do, is to use material that is culturally specific, but then allow it to maybe access more or broader cultural conversations about taste, about power, about intimacy, and portraiture. So I certainly find myself doing a little bit more explaining or a little bit more contextualizing over there, whereas here, I really pay attention to maybe some of the subtleties of the work. So yeah, and as far as how it's received, I mean, I don't know. I haven't actually shown here in quite a long time. The last work that I showed was a puppet show that I had made when I was doing the Delfina residency in London. So this is really the first comprehensive body of photographs that I've shown since 2016 at the Third Line, which was a much smaller show. So I'm curious to talk to people and see what they think.
That brings up the A word. I want to ask you about the A word. It's been said that the presiding condition that affected my generation, Generation X, was depression, and that Generation Y is mainly suffering from anxiety. Can I get a whoop? Whoop to anxiety. I'm wondering. I mean, obviously, we could talk endlessly about the kind of negative aspect of ambient anxiety, of nano anxiety, or all these sort of things. But is there actually a way to weaponize anxiety? And is that something you either consciously or unconsciously you're doing with your work?
I consciously do it in my class that I'm teaching called How to Be Anxious at RISD. It's called How to Be Anxious: critical issues in photography, but it's the class is basically three parts. One of them is a kind of literally critical perspectives or critical theory in image making. So we read lots of Sontag, we read Ariella Azoulay, Jalal Tawfiq, and then the other parts are literally how to think about how to kind of you use weaponize. I say harness because it's a softer word, but how to harness maybe some questions that we're having about our own responsibilities in the world, civic duty or different, artistic responsibility. But then the other part of it is literally giving students, workshops on public speaking, things that they might actually be mindfully anxious about. But I don't use that word. I don't mean to diminish. I think that the word anxiety is used a lot in memes now, and everybody talks about having anxiety, and it's true. But I don't, as somebody with both clinical anxiety and layman's
cultural anxiety.
Yeah, cultural. I use the term broadly, but I don't mean to also make light or levity of very serious panic disorder. So I like to just add, throw that in there. But yeah, I do think it is everywhere, and I think being surrounded by images is a part of that. Is that there's no filter anymore.
Any more questions? Because I've got one last one over here.
Hi.
Hi.
You talked about a couple of professional photographers taking photos in Dubai Mall and Mall of the Emirates, and you were quite critical about how they saw things and took photos rather missing or not being insightful or meaningless, perhaps. Did you think about going through their exact steps and taking pictures of what they had seen and show us what you would see, and take the same pictures or pictures in the same places with different eyes?
Thank you for that question. I think maybe I wouldn't necessarily say meaningless. I think I would say just one-dimensional, right? Is that it's like the moment, it's like a reaction to the moment, but then it doesn't really go deeper into what that moment actually means. So as far as retracing their steps, I mean, I work in a lot of malls. Like, commercial spaces are really a comfortable space for me and my work. And I think it maybe goes back to the earlier conversation that we were having about counter images and how I almost prefer to really think about where my own curiosities might take me and where my own research might take me, rather than responding, because I do deeply admire these photographers and their kind of, their earlier bodies of work. So my intention is not necessarily to badmouth people, but it is to maybe hold photographers to higher standards of incisiveness and curiosity, and to maybe ask them for sharper reads, instead of just this kind of like quick travel photography style, very much one-dimensional surface read of a place.
I like the idea. It reminds me of Gus Van Sant, who remade Hitchcock's Psycho frame for frame, but did it in color, but in exactly the same shooting schedule, 30 years. Anyone else?
Yeah, one more question.
One more over there. Thank you.
Hi, Farah.
Hi.
I want to ask you a question that I think is a bit of a devil's advocate question, because I struggle with these kind of minefields as well.
Yeah.
So the work from DragonBot, for example, do you think there's a risk that we're essentializing that phenomena, much like how people in the West have looked at us in a certain way? I mean, we all had a laugh at the expense of the Chinese tonight. But, and on a more serious note, do you think that there is a chance that there is a misinterpretation, or by looking at that on a surface level, and you're by being attracted to the things that you are, that perhaps the fact that the Chinese, the DragonBot, for example, serves a purpose to hundreds of thousands of people who live in this country because they can't afford other goods, etc.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's certainly something that I think about as I kind of navigate my own moral compass, to use a term from earlier. I think I kind of understand your concerns and your questions, and I think it's not necessarily just a kind of maybe generalize a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily a laugh at the expense of the Chinese. I think it's a laugh at the expense of ourselves in a way for kind of falling for this, but also, English is very much, it's my first language, but in a way it's also my second language. I struggle with translation a lot of the time, and I think the kind of phenomenon of navigating multiple languages and navigating things like meanings that might be lost in translation is something that is very is very familiar to a lot of the people who grew up here, or a lot of the people who live here. So I think to maybe bring it into a more general conversation about what translation might mean and how words can get warped in that process. In terms of maybe essentializing a place that I'm not necessarily a part of, I am actually one of many people who do benefit from DragonBot. DragonBot is within my budget. It's within the things that I can afford. And I go there because I need things, as well as because I think that it is an incredible place to look at. So for me, I don't think that, I think that there's certainly questions about representation and kind of relatability and exploitation in all of the work that I do, and I think every photographer should be mindful of those things, and I don't think I've necessarily figured out something that works for me and makes me feel really good. But I do think that being interested in the aesthetics of a place and maybe focusing on the aesthetics of a place, what I hope is that it could possibly reveal something a little bit deeper about all of the different worlds that come together within DragonBot, which very much cater to, as Shimon said, a lot of people from the Middle East cater to their tastes and really have them in mind as consumers. There's also a little bit of a research component that goes into DragonBot, in the sense that I've been going and kind of asking a lot of these shops to talk about their kind of their kind of like production lines, and thinking about where they get a lot of their fabrics, where they assemble, and that in a way has become less about DragonBot and more about all of these different places around the Emirates that sell these kinds of furniture, and maybe trying to link that to a broader history. But I do appreciate your question, because I think it brings up something that I am constantly mindful of, and I think that everybody who makes images should certainly be mindful of.
Last question, really extremely important and serious, baking. You've used baking, cakes, shortbread, brownies, as a way, I think one of the non-pharmaceutical ways of battling anxiety. Why are there so many goddamn baking programs on TV these days? And is there, can we measure global anxiety by the number of baking shows that are on TV? What the hell's going on?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, but I will say that my favorite baking show is the Great British Bake Off, formerly the Great British Baking Show, and the reason being is that it is so wholesome, and I think that we are so lacking in wholesome reality TV that a show like that is so necessary and so soothing, because none of these people, have any ill will towards each other. They're all so supportive. They also win nothing at the end. They put so much time and so much care into that competition. They win nothing. I mean, yes, you could argue, as we did last night, that they
book deals, TV shows,
whatever. But a lot of them don't get those things because they're not necessarily the most charismatic characters on the show. So yes, I do. I bake a lot. I like the idea of chemistry, of spending time on a task that has instructions to it. I don't experiment in the kitchen. I like it when somebody just tells me what to do on allrecipes.com or whatever, because I don't use cookbooks, because, who uses them?
Because you're a genius.
Because I'm a genius. And then the most that I'll do in terms of creativity is play with decorations.
Thank you very much. Exactly 60 minutes. Wow. Amazingly on time.
Great.
Thank you all for coming this evening. Will you please join me in thanking Farah Al-Qasimi?